It's my pleasure to open the last session with three American colleagues and Tad Schmaltz, Murray Miles, and Steve Nadler. I want to thank them particularly for their presence. My first pleasure is to introduce Murray Miles because it's the first time that Murray is with us in the seminar, and it was the first book, is wonderful book, Insight and Inference, Descartes' founding principle in modern philosophy. This is just the first book that I reviewed for the Bulletin Cartesiani. And so it's with the greatest pleasure that I can introduce him. Prego, Murray, grazie di essere qui.
Grazie. Yes, thanks very much for the introduction. I only discovered the existence of the Centro when I tracked down the review that you wrote so many years ago of my book. But I certainly intend to keep it well in view in the future. The title of my paper is The Three Faces of the Cogito, Section 1, an introduction. One thing that Plato's, Aristotle's, and Descartes' theories of the knowledge of first principles all have in common is the apparently mysterious nature of the cognitive process involved. While memorable and vivid images like Descartes' seeds of truth implanted in the mind by God, or Aristotle's band of soldiers regrouping after a rout, are hardly more satisfactory, philosophically speaking, than the Platonic myth of the soul's recollection of insights acquired during its prenatal existence in the realm of the forms. Given that Descartes' observations on the subject are mostly responses to queries regarding the primitiveness of his first principle par excellence, cogito ergo sum, the most that can be hoped for is an inevitably somewhat conjectural rational reconstruction of the process by which this and other first principles are known. Section 3 of my paper attempts such a reconstruction. Notwithstanding the misleading use of the logical particle, Descartes' responses to the queries just mentioned are at least sufficient to rule out both an indirect syllogistic and a direct logical inference. Everything points instead to a gradually unfolding direct intuition of the universal in the particular, not unlike that described by Aristotle in the Posterior Analytics. For one thing, Descartes describes the apprehension of the strictly universal and necessary relation between thinking and existing as a simplex mentis intuitus. As with Aristotelian epagoge, moreover, it takes its rise from particulars, though Descartes' starting point is empirical introspection of one's own acts of thinking rather than, as in Aristotle, ordinary sense perception of material things. Like its Aristotelian counterpart, moreover, the process culminates in a grasp of strictly universal principles or first truths. While the different sorts of archai grasped through Aristotelian epagoge are a matter of controversy, Descartes' first principles are clearly of just three kinds. One, ideas of true and immutable natures. Two, the empirical propositions cogito and sum, which are the first items of knowledge having existential import. And three, a host of other propositional axioms or common notions having no such import whatever, including the logical principle of contradiction and the causal, as well as other strictly metaphysical principles. The next section will examine the empirical propositions cogito and sum, which are the two main faces, as I call them, of Descartes' cogito ergo sum. The same first principle presents a third face, however, the non-existential principle of the natural light, whatever things is. The bulk of the section will be devoted to the latter, since it provides the key for a detailed reconstruction of Descartes' theory of the knowledge of first principles in section 3. Section 4 concludes with a condensed summary. Section 2 then, the three faces of the cogito. And here I will share my screen with you. Can you see my PowerPoint slide now?
Yes, we are seeing your PowerPoint.
Thank you. The first of the three faces of Descartes' cogito ergo sum can be called the proto-cogito. It coincides with the first word alone, cogito, or I think. This proposition is absolutely certain, that is, immune to the three grounds of doubt in the first meditation, only as asserting the existence of a now actually occurring mental act or of a sequence of such acts, so brief as to be before the mind's reflexive gaze all at once in the same temporally extended now. It becomes uncertain as soon as the clearly and distinctly perceived intentional relatedness of such acts of thinking to something thought of is mistaken for a real relation of an existing effect or copy in the mind to some cause or original actually existing outside it. As long as the word cogito only asserts the existence of now actually occurring intentional acts, it is certain. When they speak of the Cartesian cogito, it's rarely this proto-cogito that scholars have in mind. What they usually mean is cogito and sum joined by the logical particle ergo. This may therefore be called the cogito proper. To the direct and infallible insight into the existence of now actually occurring ideas, thoughts, or mental states, the proto-cogito, the sum adds the assertion of the existence of a relatively permanent substance or thinking thing. The particle ergo indicates that the transition from cogito to sum involves some sort of mental process or inference, and the chief focus of scholarly controversy concerning the cogito proper has long been the exact nature of the inferential process signaled by the ergo. That will be the focus of the next section as well. Third and finally, there is what may be called the universal cogito, whatever things is. Unlike both the proto-cogito and the cogito proper, the universal cogito does not assert the contingent existence of anything in rerum natura. It figures rather among the common notions or axioms that Descartes also calls eternal truths or principles of the natural light of reason, none of which possesses existential import. Descartes illustrates the point using geometrical theorems, all of which, for example, that the internal angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles, remain eternally true, quote, even if perhaps no such figure exists or ever has existed anywhere outside my mind, unquote. And so for all other eternal truths as well, including that which expresses the relation between the true and immutable natures, thinking and existing. In other words, the universal cogito. It appears then that the universal cogito is a first truth or principle in a different sense than both the proto-cogito and the cogito proper. For the latter are first, or first and second respectively, in the order of knowing contingent empirical propositions, whereas the universal cogito is one among countless, Descartes' word, countless necessary a priori or eternal truths. Recalling in Principles, Part 1, Principle 10, that the authors of the sixth objections had challenged the status of the cogito ergo sum as a first truth on the grounds that in order to know that one thinks and exists, one must first know what thinking and existence are, Descartes insists that he had not intended, quote, to deny that one must first know what thought, existence, and he now adds certainty are, and that it's impossible that that which thinks should not exist, and so forth. End of quotation. Although the objectors had only mentioned thought and existence, Descartes adds both the nature of certainty and the universal cogito to the list of those things which one must know first. His reason for adding the universal cogito may have been that in answering this objection, he was recalling Gassendi's claim that the sum cannot be a primitive or first truth precisely because it's the conclusion of a logical syllogism having as its suppressed major the still more primitive truth, whatever thinks exists, and as its minor, the protocogito. Descartes had occasion to clarify the precise sense in which the universal cogito must be understood first. When Berman pointed to an apparent inconsistency between Principles 1.10, where Descartes had added the universal cogito to those concepts that the authors of the sixth objections had declared prior to the cogito ergo sum, an apparent inconsistency between that and a passage of the second replies that reads, I quote, "When we become aware that we are thinking things, this is a primary notion, as it were, prima quaedam notio, which is not derived by means of any syllogism, ex nullo syllogismo." End of quotation. To Berman, Principles 1.10 suggested that the universal cogito was the major of a syllogism, which was precisely Gassendi's objection. And this indeed conflicts with the words ex nullo syllogismo in the second replies. In his response, Descartes notes that by adding the universal cogito, he had not meant to imply, quote, that I am always expressly and explicitly aware of its priority, or that I know it before my inference. This is because I am attending only to what I experience within myself, in me exterior. For example, I am thinking, therefore I exist. I do not pay attention, Descartes continues, in the same way to the general notion, whatever thinks exists. As I've explained before, we do not separate out these universal propositions from the particular instances. Rather, it's in particular instances that we think of them. End of quote. The likely referent of, as I have explained before, is another passage in the second replies that reads, I quote, "When someone says, I am thinking, therefore I am, or I exist, he does not deduce existence from thought by means of a syllogism, per syllogismum, but recognizes it as something self-evident by a simple intuition of the mind, simplici mentis intuitu. This is clear from the fact that if he were deducing it by means of a syllogism, he would have to have had previous knowledge of the major premise, everything which thinks is or exists. Yet, in fact, he learns it from experiencing in his own case, apud se experiatur, that it's impossible that he should think without existing. It is in the nature of our mind to form general propositions out of propositions of particulars. End of quotation. Here Descartes is exploiting the distinction between knowledge of general propositions and knowledge of particulars to clarify the difference between indirect logical inference and direct, simplex, mentis intuitus. But in the conversation with Berman, he exploits a further distinction, that between implicit and explicit knowledge. In other words, between knowing something without attending to what one knows or that one knows it on the one hand, and knowing the same thing while knowing that one knows it. Particular propositions that assert truly the existence of something are always prior in the temporal order of the explicitly known. They're first with respect to us, as Aristotle would say. Nevertheless, the general concepts employed in such propositions and the universal principles of which particular propositions are instances are prior in themselves or by nature, to use Aristotle's terms once again. For the latter are known beforehand, though only implicitly, without attention, and that means somewhat obscurely and confusedly. Yet, because they're implicit in those particular items that are temporally first to be known explicitly or clearly and distinctly, universal concepts and principles too are capable of becoming known explicitly in their turn. And the same is true of universal concepts or innate ideas like thinking, existence, and certainty. They too are only implicitly understood in the explicit understanding of the proto-cogito. And like the universal cogito, they come to be the objects of explicit attention after the inference process that leads from the proto-cogito to the cogito proper. The third, generally less noticed face of the cogito is the key to the rational reconstruction of the reasoning process that leads from the proto-cogito to the cogito proper. That's the subject of the next section, section 3, a reconstruction. Prior to the detailed reconstruction of the inference process, it's worth noting that those actually occurring acts whose existence is affirmed in the proto-cogito have the ontological status of attributes in a broad sense that includes all those things Descartes variously calls modes, properties, qualities, and affections. Now, an attribute, so understood, is not the sort of thing that can exist in its own right, but only if there exists a substance for it to be in or be attributed to. Since the attributes whose existence is affirmed in the proto-cogito are all modes of thinking, they can exist only if there exists a thinking substance or thing. From this, it's clear that the reasoning process that proceeds from the proto-cogito to the cogito proper involves that common notion or innate principle of the natural light, which Descartes formulates succinctly, though ambiguously, as nothingness possesses no attributes, and which he mercifully disambiguates as follows, quote, "If we perceive the presence of some attribute, we can infer that there must also be present an existing thing or substance of which to which it may be attributed." End of quotation. And if this principle is involved, nothingness possesses no attributes. If this principle is involved, then so, of course, are the concepts or innate ideas, attribute, and substance. It's not, however, that nothingness has no attributes is the suppressed universal major of a syllogism. On the contrary, this common notion, or axiom comes to be known explicitly as a universal truth only after the particular truth sum. So much for preliminaries. Now for the detailed reconstruction of Descartes' theory of the process by which first principles are known. Through introspection and reflection upon the immediate intuition of something actually existing in the mind, there gradually emerges an explicit or clear and distinct understanding of what thinking is, what existence is, and of the fact that the protocogito is certain, hence also what certainty is. In the course of still further reflection, one gradually comes to understand explicitly the meaning of other innate concepts and of the truth of other innate principles that were already understood implicitly and in concreto in the very act of understanding the protocogito. Now, among the innate ideas or concepts rendered clearly and distinct through such reflection on the protocogito are attribute and substance, which are just as primitive as the innate concepts, thinking, existence, and certainty. As no more than an implicit or obscure and confused understanding of these latter is required for a grasp of the certainty of the protocogito, so only an implicit understanding of attribute and substance and of the principle. If we perceive the presence of some attribute, we can infer that there must also be present an existing thing or substance, is all that's necessary. All that's necessary is an implicit understanding for the transition from the protocogito to the cogito proper. In this way, there gradually emerges an explicit insight into the existence of a particular substance, sum, as something that was already, if still only implicitly, co-understood in the explicit understanding of the protocogito. On the grasp of the cogito proper, cogito ergo sum, may follow, if one directs one's attention that way, the non-existential insight into the universal cogito, whatever thinks exists, and any of the countless other non-existential truths of the natural light, including the axiom, nothingness has no attributes. It's likewise by reflecting on the existential character of the protocogito and the cogito proper that the causal principle, something cannot come from nothing, comes to be known explicitly. That principle then serves in the indirect proofs of further truths regarding the existence of things outside the mind, of God's existence in the first instance, and then of that of the material world. However, the gradual unfolding of a series of immediate insights that precedes and makes possible such logical demonstrations of the existence of external things is an intuitive process through and through. True, it takes place in a series of intuitions unfolding over the course of a sequence of nows, rather than all at once in a flash of insight. Moreover, the entire process figures as one of those things that Descartes means by deductio when he opposes it to intuitus in the rules. Still, it's precisely because the process is at each stage intuitive that Descartes there insists on the fluidity of the boundary between intuition and deduction. Fluidity, that is, until such time as reliance on memory breaks the chain of immediate intuitions, thus rendering the reasoning deductive and no longer intuitive. Because this gradual unfolding this gradually unfolding intuitive process is among those things that Descartes understands by deductio, it also figures among those that he has in mind when he uses the word infer and when he uses the logical particle ergo. While inference in this sense has nothing to do with direct or indirect logical inference, it bears, as noted in the introduction, a certain family resemblance to Aristotelian epagoge. With that, the rational construction of Descartes' theory of the knowledge of first principles is essentially complete. The process starts from principles that remain relatively obscure and confused as long as they are only implicitly understood as instantiated in concreto in clearly perceived particulars. And it advances from the clear and distinct perception of those same principles in abstracto, that is, apart from the particulars in which they are concretely instantiated. The passage from implicit to explicit understanding is thus from obscure and confused, implicit, to clear and distinct, explicit, perception, and at the same time from a clearly perceived particular instance of a universal truth to a clear and distinct conception of that same universal truth in abstracto. To apply this now to nothingness has no attributes and the universal cogito, it must be recalled that to think for Descartes is to be at least implicitly aware of that all one's thoughts are existing attributes, and that qua attributes they must exist in a thinking substance. Thus, one passes from cogito to sum. In continued reflection, the implicitly understood universal principle, nothingness has no attributes, may itself come to be known clearly and distinctly in the abstract. Through the same process of reflection, one also becomes explicitly aware of the general concepts, attribute, substance, thinking, existence, certainty. Reflecting on thinking and existence, on those two concepts, one becomes explicitly aware of the necessary relation between them. In other words, that whatever thinks exists. But like nothingness has no attributes, the universal cogito is grasped in its unrestricted universality, not through any Humean process of generalization over members of a class, nor yet all at once in a mysterious Platonic flash of insight, but through an epagogic process of gradually becoming aware of the abstract universal by a process of sustained reflection on particular acts of thinking in which it is instantiated. Conclusion, final section. Summing up then, we can say that the progress of the mind by which all first principles are known starts from the protocogito and proceeds via an implicit understanding of certain concepts and principles of the natural light that are concretely instantiated in the protocogito to the cogito proper, and thence to the explicit understanding of those very concepts and principles in abstracto. The whole process then goes from 1, the protocogito, via an implicit understanding of 3, the universal cogito and other universal principles and innate concepts, to 2, the cogito proper, and then back again to 3, the universal principles and concepts, this time, however, understood clearly and distinctly in abstracto. It's thus, in a certain way, recursive or circular, as well as broadly epagogic. And the question with which I'd like to conclude is this a vicious Or is it rather, as I'm inclined to think, a virtuous circle? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
This
This
fantastic.
fantastic.
And
And
now, my pleasure to introduce Tad Schmaltz as a paper on delocated subject control, revisiting Hobbes' critique of Descartes. Prego, Tad, grazie.
Thank you, Igor. Thanks for the invitation to speak to this group. There is the PowerPoint. Mattia will be running it, or Igor, one of you. Let me start. My presentation revisits Hobbes' critique of Descartes' Cogito. The attempt here is not to defend Hobbes' much criticized argument in his exchange with Descartes for the conclusion that the subject of thought is material. Rather, this argument provides the occasion to explore a different argument for this conclusion and construct on the basis of what we find in Hobbes's writings, one which serves to connect his views to those of Henry Moore, critic of Hobbesian materialism, as well as Cartesian dualism. So let me start from a passage from Pierre Bayle's Dictionnaire historique et critique. I'll read the quote on the top of the slide there. Until Descartes, all our learned men, whether theologians or philosophers, have ascribed extension to spirits, an infinite one to God, and a finite one to angels and to rational souls. The Cartesians have overthrown all these doctrines. They say that spirits have no kind of extension, nor local presence, but their view is rejected as absurd. I'll return to this passage briefly at the end of my presentation. So my remarks today have the following structure. First, I'll provide a summary of the exchange between Hobbes and Descartes on the issue of the subject of thought, and consider, starting with Descartes, that Hobbes's remarks in this exchange reflect a dogmatic materialism. This charge will lead us to the, secondly, this charge will lead us to the claim in the recent literature that during the 1640s, Hobbes, in fact, was not even a materialist, much less a dogmatic one. Third, in countering this claim, I appeal to an argument for materialism in Hobbes that dates from 1640, and I call this, for reasons that will become clear, the location argument. Fourth, we will find a version of this argument in the work of the anti-Hobbesian materialist and anti-Cartesian dualist, Henry Moore. Fifthly, this argument is relevant to an important exchange between Descartes in correspondence on the question of whether immaterial substances are extended. And finally, in light of this exchange, I'll return to the charge that Hobbes is a dogmatic materialist. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So let's start then with Hobbes's critique of the Cogito. It's kind of small, but I'm hoping you can read it. I'll read it to you. This is from Hobbes's third objections. Sum res cogitans, correct. For from the fact that I think or have phantasms, whether awake or asleep, it follows that I am thinking. And from the fact that I am thinking, it follows ego sum, for that which thinks is not nothing. But when Descartes adds, hoc est mens animus intellectus ratio, doubt arises. For in the same way, I can say sum ambulans ergo sum ambulatio. So the objection here is that Descartes is confusing the subject of the act of thinking with the act of thinking itself. Hobbes's initial claim is that Descartes is dogmatic in assuming that the subject of the act of thinking is itself immaterial. But quickly, Hobbes goes beyond this claim in arguing that, in fact, Descartes is committed to the conclusion that the subject is material. This is the next quote. And from this, it seems to follow that the thinking thing is something corporeal. For the subjects of all actions seem to be understood under the ratio of the corporeal or under the ratio of the material, as Descartes himself shows afterwards in the example of the wax. And we can go to the next slide. So, to say the least, Descartes was not impressed with the argument that the subject of thought must be material. And here's the quote from the third replies. But without any reason, and contrary to all logic, and to every customary way of speaking, Hobbes adds, hic videri siqui rem cogitatem esse corporeum quid. For the subjects of all actions are indeed understood under the ratio of substance, or even if you wish, under the ratio of matter, namely metaphysical, not, however, under the ratio of body. So, though it follows from Hobbes's distinction of a subject from its acts that the subject must be conceived under the ratio of the substance or metaphysical matter, Descartes saw no reason to think that the subject must be conceived under the ratio of body. Nor did he think that such a conclusion can plausibly be held to follow from his discussion of the wax in the second meditation. So the quote from Descartes, nor did I prove from the example of the wax anything other than that color, hardness, and shape do not pertain to the formal ratio of the wax itself. Neither they're also the formal ratio of mind, nor indeed the formal ratio of body. And on this point, I think it must be said, advantage Descartes. But does Hobbes himself have any reason beyond Descartes' discussion of the wax to think that any subject of an act must be material? In fact, in a standard interpretation of Hobbes's remark, third objections, there is such a further reading. And we can go to the next slide. So here's what I call the standard interpretation, and I'll quote from two commentators on this issue. First quote is from Dan Garber. It says, the argument here in Hobbes is that since all our thoughts derive from the senses, we have no conception of anything that is not extended, and thus body. If we can have no extension of anything but body, it follows, Hobbes holds, that the subject of accidents of thought cannot be anything but body. And I think it would be a similar view in a passage from Ed Curley, and that's the next passage there. To have an idea or conception of anything is to have an image of it, but every image is necessarily of some extended thing. So lacking an image of any non-extended thing, we cannot conceive it. And Curley's judgment on this is as follows. I do not find this argument satisfactory. It is Hobbes at his most dogmatic. So I take it what's dogmatic here is to argue from the fact that we have no sensory image of an immaterial subject of thoughts, which Descartes readily accepts, to the conclusion that such a subject is impossible, which Descartes rejects on the grounds that we have purely intellectual ideas of immaterial substances. To limit what is possible to the realm of sensory ideas is to dogmatically assume the impossibility of immaterial substances. Now, I think the sort of argument standardly attributed to Hobbes can be extracted from the third objections, and I'll not be concerned here to defend this argument against Curley's charge of dogmatism, but I do want to claim that there is a basis in Hobbes for a different argument for a materialist conception of the subject of thought. Such an argument will emerge from a consideration of the recent claim of Stuart Duncan, which is directed against the standard interpretation of Hobbes I just considered, that Hobbes, in fact, was not a materialist during the 1640s. And we can go on to the next slide. So here's the relevant quote from Duncan's article, the first quote there. In his work of the 1640s, Hobbes is not a materialist. He does not believe that all substances must be bodies, and is even unsure whether the human being is material. So in support of this perhaps surprising claim about Hobbes, Duncan emphasizes the following remark from the third objections. Hobbes says, the idea of myself arises if considering my body from sight, and if the soul, there is no idea of the soul at all, but by reason that there is something within the human body that gives it the animal motion by means of which it has sensations and moves. And this is something we call the soul without having an idea of it. According to Duncan, this remark indicates the following, and the quote from Duncan next. We could easily understand Hobbes only to be expressing the conditional. If we were to understand the mind, it would be as material. But he's allowing for the possibility of positing something I know not what, as the soul that's distinct from body as the subject of thought. So according to Duncan, this is a possibility Hobbes is allowing for in the third objections. Okay, so go to the next slide then. And this will be in response to Duncan. I think there is an argument for materialism in Hobbes's work that dates from the time of the third objections. And this is from the Elements of Law, the first passage there. By the name of spirit, we understand a body natural that filleth up the place which the image of the visible body might fill up. To conceive a spirit is to conceive of something that hath dimension, but spirit supernatural commonly signify some substance without dimension, which two words do flatly contradict one another. And this passage actually has a faint echo in the third objections, although not from a passage that it's discussing the issue of the cogito. This rather concerns true and immutable natures, where Hobbes says, for whatever, or enunciates the principle, for whatever is nowhere is not, and thus has neither being nor any nature. So to exist, you must exist somewhere. That's the important principle that I'm drawing here from Hobbes. I think I will skip the next quote in the interest of time. If we could go to the next slide. So what I'm drawing from the Elements of Law is an argument that I'll call the location argument, and we see more standard form of it, or more detailed form of it, later in the Leviathan. So the passage here, first passage slide, every part of the universe is body, and that which is not body is no part of the universe. And because the universe is all, that which is no part of it is nothing, and consequently nowhere. Nor does it follow from hence that spirits are nothing, for they have dimensions, and are therefore bodies. And this text also, the Leviathan, also includes an echo of the claim in the Elements of Law that the words substance without dimension do flatly contradict one another. How he puts it in the Leviathan is as follows: substance and body signify the same thing, and therefore substance and corporeal are words which, when they are joined together, destroy one another, as if a man should say an incorporeal body. So on the view here, it is most decidedly not the case that the subject of thought could be a something I know not what, distinct from body, which is a possibility that Duncan takes to be left open in the third objections. Now, let us return to the claim in the third objections against Descartes. So the passage there, for the subjects of all actions seem to be understood in terms of something corporeal or in terms of something material. On the standard interpretation, this argument is supported by what Curley has called the dogmatic claim that anything possible must be conceivable in terms of sensory ideas of material things. But though it is not found in the third objections itself, I think we can draw from what I call the location argument the following line of thought that does not depend on this claim about ideas. And the argument I'm drawing from the location argument is as follows. The subject of any action must be located somewhere, invoking the principle for to be nowhere is not to be. Only something that is extended or has dimensions can be located somewhere. Everything that is extended is part of the universe. Everything that is part of the universe is a body. And in conclusion, the subject of any action must be a body. So we get to the materiality of the subject of thought from the fact that the subject of thought must be located, must be somewhere, thus must have extension, thus must be material. Okay, so question might now be, so the earlier question is it dogmatic to assume that we can only conceive of things in terms of sensory ideas? Now the question is whether it's dogmatic to assume that whatever can exist must be located somewhere and so be extended. And I think one argument that this is not dogmatic appeals that this same premise was accepted by Henry Moore, who was a critic of Hobbes's materialism. So let's move on to Moore's location argument. This next slide. There we go. So as I said, Moore is a critic both of Descartes and of Hobbes. And the objection, one of his prominent objections to Cartesian dualism is that it is committed to an untenable, what he called nullibism. That is the view that immaterial substances are literally nowhere. I won't read the quote. Essentially, the argument is that the fact that nullibism is untenable is shown by the fact that those who defend it, Descartes, admit that immaterial substances have the power to act on bodies. But according to Moore, wherever the immaterial substance acts, there it must be located. And since it must be located, it must be extended. So even immaterial substances have to be extended insofar as they act on bodies. Now, where Moore differs from Hobbes is in holding that something can be extended without being material. And in that final quote, Moore distinguishes between body, a substance impenetrable and discernible or divisible, from spirit, a substance penetrable and indiscernible. So spirits have an extension as bodies do, but their extension is penetrable and indivisible rather than impenetrable and divisible, as in the case of bodies. Now, an earlier version of this distinction between body and spirit made its way into an important correspondence that Moore had with Descartes, in which he objected to Descartes' official claim that the essence of body consists in extension. So let's talk about this extension. And here is the objection in Moore's initial letter to Descartes, which I'll read. First, you offer a definition of matter or body that is much more broad than suits it. For God seems to be an extended thing as well as an angel, even more anything subsisting per se, so that extension seems to be contained in the same limits as the absolute essence of things, which nonetheless vary according to the variety of the essences themselves. More claims that something else beyond mere extension must belong to the essence of body in order to distinguish it from immaterial things. And in the next quote, the additional elements he points to are tangibility and impenetrability. And in his later writings, the two features were instead impenetrability and discernibility. Tangibility drops out later on. Descartes' initial response is to deny that the true extension can be found in substances, and that's in the last quote on the slide. I won't read that, but what he indicates there does not deny that such substances, immaterial substances, can have a location. He says God and several angels can exist in one and the same place. So he's admitting that God and angels can be located, and to that extent, he's conceding to more that immaterial substances can have a location, but he still disagrees with the view in Moore that immaterial substances, God, angels, rational souls, are essentially extended. Sorry, that's not there. That's coming up. The view here is rather that they're extended, but they're not there by an impenetrable extension. But of course, that is Moore's claim as well. So there does seem to be a lot of a concession to Moore in the initial exchange. So go to Moore's rejoinder here. So in that first passage, Moore concedes that, which is his view, that immaterial substances lack tangibility and impenetrability found in the extension of bodies. But he argues that insofar as these substances exist, they must be located somewhere, and insofar as they are located, they must have a true extension, essero alium vero extensionem aeque verum. Now, in response, Descartes, perhaps surprisingly, in light of Moore's later characterization of him as a nullibist, concedes the point. He says, "Essero alium vero extensionem aeque verum." Finally, we agree on the thing. There remains a question of the name. Namely, if this latter must be said to be an equally true extension. However, according to me, I understand in God, in angels, and in our mind, not an extension of substance, but of power only, namely such that an angel can exercise its power, now in a greater part, now in a lesser part, corporeal substance. But, and this is a passage, part of it I wanted to emphasize, if there were no bodies, I would also understand no space with which an angel or God would be coexistent. So there's a concession to Moore, but with the qualification that it's possible for immaterial substances to exist nowhere, to have no extension. In the case where there are no bodies, there's no space. In fact, I would argue, some disagree, and we can perhaps talk about this more, Descartes' claim that mind and body are really distinct requires the conceivability that mind can exist on its own without any body existing. To this extent, then, Descartes' dualism does indeed entail a kind of nihilism. Okay, so now let's return to the issue of dogmatism in the dispute between Hobbes and Descartes over the Cogito. So recall the case for Hobbes's dogmatism. In the third objections, he dogmatically relies on the assumption that the only subject of actions that can exist must be imaginable, and so must be a body. But as I've shown, the key premise of the location argument is that any such subject must be located somewhere. And this premise is accepted by the dualist More, which shows that it doesn't assume materialism. What's controversial is going to be Hobbes' further premise that a subject can be located somewhere only in virtue of its impenetrable extension. But now I think we can consider whether the charge of dogmatism can be turned against Descartes. An initial point is that in his exchange with More, Descartes in fact agrees with Hobbes that the true extension by which something occupies a place requires impenetrability and thus materiality. But he concedes to More that immaterial substances can be located by means of another kind of extension. Though there's a question about whether he's allowing here that the immaterial substances themselves are extended or only their effects. Some people have argued it's only the latter. I think there are grounds for attributing the former to Descartes, but that's something we can discuss further. I have argued, though, however briefly, that Descartes' dualism requires that immaterial minds can exist without extension and thus nowhere. From the perspective of Hobbes and More, the assumption that this sort of existence is possible is clearly dogmatic. And given the views in the passage from Bayle with which we started, such an assumption must seem to quote from Bayle, all our learned men, whether theologians or philosophers, to be not only dogmatic, but, as Bayle emphasized, absurd. Thank you very much. And thanks, Mattia and Igor, for handling the slides. This is the literature I cited in the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. Our pleasure. Beautiful, beautiful presentation. I think that we have to discuss about that in the debate. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Nadler. Thank you, Steve, to be here. And please.
Thank you. Thanks, Igor, and thanks, Sigrid, for the invitation. And thanks, Mattia, for the technical help. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm also going to just put up the paper I'm reading. I think it'll be easier for people to follow me as I read along. So let's see if I can get this to work. Whoops, that didn't work. Can you see the?
Yes.
It
paper?
works perfectly. You can see it,
so you
your
can
document.
see the paper. Good. So Descartes, I suspect, would be quite surprised by the amount of scholarly attention that has been devoted to his argument for the certainty of his own existence. Its only real competition for popularity in the older literature is the mind-body distinction and union, and possibly the so-called Cartesian circle. The argument has even been credited with representing the origins of subjectivity, the invention of the individual, and the creation of modernity. That's a lot of weight to place on a three-word sentence. Whether in the cogito ergo sum form, in which that argument appears in the Discours de la Méthode, or the ego sum ego existo presentation in the Meditations on First Philosophy, the meditator's discovery of the certainty of his own existence was a mere moment in his, Descartes' epistemological itinerary, which in turn was just an opening foundational stage in his overall metaphysical and scientific project. After all, the exercise of the Meditations itself was supposed to be something that a philosopher should do only once in life in order to set him or herself on the correct path to true knowledge. And the cogito itself is a mere tool. It is foundational, not in the sense that it serves as a starting premise for the a priori deduction of all subsequent knowledge, as it has been so poorly caricatured in the old-fashioned textbook accounts of Descartes. Rather, it's foundational only in the sense that it allows Descartes to identify the criterion of indubitable certainty, the clarity and distinctness of concepts, thoughts, or ideas, that will serve him so well as he establishes the existence of God and all the metaphysical and scientific knowledge that is guaranteed by divine benevolence. When we turn to Descartes' 17th century followers, especially the first generation of Cartesians active in the decades after his death in 1650, we find a noticeable variety of attitudes toward the Cogito argument, from a faithful reproduction and employment of Descartes' own reasoning to an apparent lack of interest in it and very little use made of it in the later elaborations, modifications, and defenses of Descartes' system. In this presentation, I'd like to offer some preliminary and sketchy remarks, very preliminary and sketchy, I admit, of the legacy of the Cogito among this generation of Cartesians. And for the sake of concision and focus, I'll concentrate only on three important French Cartesians of the 1660s and 70s. And thus, my apologies to two other equally important and interesting Cartesians working in the Netherlands and Germany during the same period, Johannes Clauberg and Arnold Hoylink. The case of Clauberg is rather complex, not least because he seems to have changed his mind about the Cogito over the course of his career. In the first edition of his Elementa Philosophiae, sive Ontosophia, published in 1647, the starting point of philosophy is not any discovery of the certainty of one's own existence, but pure ontology, the study of being qua being. What is first and most easily known by the intellect, he claims, is the concept of being, or ens, in its most general sense, namely, whatever can be conceived. In the 1664 edition, however, things appear to have changed. He does note toward the beginning of the work that concerning no thing can it be acquired as to whether it exists unless it is first known in some way what it is, an apparent reversal of the analytical order of discovery that Descartes follows in the Meditations. However, according to the fifth item of the first article of the Annotationes added to this edition, it seems that Cartesian first philosophy now precedes ontology, and the first item in the Prima Philosophia is knowledge of the existence and nature of the thinking mind. And here's a brief quote. First philosophy is so called not because of the universality of the object with which it is concerned, but because he who would philosophize in an orderly manner must begin from those things, namely from the knowledge of his mind and of God, etc. This first philosophy is contained in the 6 Meditations of Descartes and summarized in the first part of his Principles of Philosophy. For the later Clauberg, in other words, properly ordered philosophy must start with the Cogito, a knowledge of, first, the existence, and only then the nature of the human mind. Hoylink may have an even more complicated case, in part because the Cogito does indeed play a large role in the elaboration of his philosophy, and especially his ethics, as Alain Delattre has shown in his large study of Hoylink's occasionalism. On the other hand, the place of the Cogito in Hoylink's system is pretty clear and straightforward. Hoylink begins his Metaphysica Vera, probably written in the late 1650s or early 1660s, by explaining how, before we can enter into first knowledge, which is a part of metaphysics, we must first clear the mind of all prior beliefs, much as Descartes undertook in the first Meditations. I'll skip the quote. Only then will we be properly prepared to recognize the clear and distinct propositions that are our goal. And the first truth so discovered is, of course, the proposition that asserts one's own existence. Proposition 1 of the first part of the Metaphysica Vera states simply, I think, therefore I exist. And he notes that, considering myself to be utterly ignorant in every way and doubting everything, he concludes that I perceive at once that I have thought all these things, and in consequence that I exist. It is impossible that I should have thoughts, that I should think them, and yet be nothing. And this is the first knowledge that tells me that I think and that I exist. We can ignore the question-begging way in which the argument is framed in this particular text, and note simply that Hoylink's language here and in the next passage closely follows the particular way in which Descartes presents the Cogito argument in the Principia Philosophiae. This is Descartes. We cannot suppose that we who are having such thoughts are nothing. Accordingly, this piece of knowledge, I am thinking and therefore I exist, is the first and most certain to occur to anyone who philosophizes in an orderly way. For good measure, Hoylink adds a second, more formal and synthetic argument in an annotation to the next proposition. An essential premise in the argument is the following. Consciousness and knowledge imply subordination of the known to the knower. Where there is knowledge, there must be both someone knowing and someone known, something known, and to nothing no modification belongs, and therefore it cannot either know or be known. From here, having established the existence of the knowing mind, Hoylink goes on to argue for the simplicity of the mind as a substance, the causal independence of mind and body, with God doing all the heavy causal work, and even the impossibility of a true union between the two substances in a human being. But as I said before, discussing Klauberg and Hoylink, I don't want to discuss Klauberg and Hoylink. Rather, let's focus on three thinkers who can rightly be regarded as the most important French Cartesians of the mid-17th century. And I begin with that most faithful of faithful Cartesians, Louis de Laforge. Shortly after finishing his editorial remarks and illustrations for Clercelier's 1664 edition of Descartes' Treatise on Man, Laforge put the finishing touches on his own Traité de l'Esprit de l'Homme. Published in 1666, Laforge regarded this work as a continuation of Descartes' own project to provide a complete account of human nature, both body and soul. While Laforge was not averse to correcting Descartes when necessary, he always did so in the name of consistency within and the truth of the Cartesian project. His stated goal in the treatise is de rechercher ce que la seule lumière naturelle nous enseigne sur la nature de l'esprit, de ses facultés et de ses fonctions. And he adds that he does so à suivre la vérité et les traces de M. Descartes. Now, on the face of it, it might appear that Laforge follows Descartes not only in terms of the content of his views, but in his method and order of inquiry as well. After all, the first substantive chapter is titled De la nature de l'esprit de l'homme et qu'il est plus aisé à connaître que le corps. Moreover, among Laforge's first tasks is to employ the method of doubt. I'll skip the quote for the sake of time. This leads Laforge, in good Cartesian fashion, to doubt not only the existence of all sensible things, but also mathematical truths, as long as he is not actively applying his mind to considering them. After all, he suggests, an omnipotent God could have created him of such a nature that I go wrong every time with everything that seems to be the most evident, and many others. And yet, he concludes, there appears to be one thing that cannot possibly be doubted. Mais pendant que je doute tout ainsi de tout et que je pense qu'il n'y a rien de certain, aucun esprit, aucun corps, point de ciel, point de terre, à tout le moins, moi qui doute, moi qui pense ne suis-je pas quelque chose? Oui, certes, quelque imparfait que je sois, quel que soit comprenne à me décevoir, il faut de nécessité que j'existe pendant que je pense. All this sounds perfectly familiar, and there's no reason to go over it. The language comes right out of Descartes, right down to the conclusion. Partant, je conclus de tout ce discours, premièrement, que cette proposition, je pense donc je suis, est la première conclusion certaine qui se présente à ceux qui conduisent leur pensée par ordre. Could we ask for a more faithful rendering of Descartes' first principle and the corollary that there is nothing that is more easily known than the existence and subsequently the nature and properties of the human mind, cette substance qui pense en moi? From here, Laforge goes on to demonstrate that the mind, or anything that thinks, is immaterial, and that it is thus distinct from body or extension. I'll skip the quote. In fact, at one point, Laforge confesses that all he is doing here is summarizing Descartes' moves in the Meditations. There are only two things that might give one pause when assessing the fidelity of Laforge's vision of the importance of the cogito in the order of knowledge. First, right at the opening of chapter 2, and well before establishing the certainty of his own existence, Laforge offers two metaphysical remarks. One concerns not so much the nature of the human mind, but its essential functions. Par l'esprit de l'homme, nous entendons ce principe intérieur de toutes nos connaissances, de nos apathies et de nos volontés, par le moyen duquel nous produisons toutes nos fonctions en enfermant quelques pensées. Then he asserts that this inner principle of our knowledge doit être une substance. Having first established these metaphysical points, he then goes on to say that la seconde chose qu'il faut considérer is the fact that while we do not yet know the nature or condition of this thinking substance, which is a strange thing to say at this point, since to know that the mind is a thinking substance is indeed to know its nature, we do know its existence and what it is better than we know the existence of the body and extended substance. Given the nature of Laforge's project, however, these methodological departures can be forgiven. After all, in the opening sections of the treatise, he is not himself beginning his philosophizing from first principles. Descartes has already taken care of that, and Laforge is only starting from where his mentor has left off. Laforge then sets the benchmark. That is the benchmark of fidelity to Descartes and the use of the cogito. The more problematic cases with respect to Cartesian attitudes toward and uses of the cogito, and which stand in stark contrast to Laforge's near verbatim fidelity, are Cordemois and Malebranche. Cordemois published his Le Discernement du corps de l'âme at around the same time as Laforge's treatise. And like Laforge's treatise, the aim of the work is to elaborate the nature of the mind and the body and their mutual relations according to basic Cartesian principles. However, despite Cordemois' fine, if rather unorthodox Cartesian credentials, the treatise starts off in a very un-Cartesian way. On sait qu'il y a des corps et que le nombre en est presque infini. Thus, it looks like the first principle of Cordemois' philosophy is an empirical one. There are bodies. Moreover, in a further un-Cartesian move, he distinguishes body from matter. Bodies, that is, it's not un-Cartesian to distinguish body from matter, but, well, it isn't the way he does it. So, bodies are extended substances, atoms, essentially, and matter is a collection of bodies. The first four of Cordemois' discourses are devoted to strictly material topics, bodies and their motions, including the argument for the occasionalist conclusion that the first and only cause of the motions of bodies is God. It is not until the fifth discourse that Cordemois broaches the subject of the relationship between mind and body, and especially the nature of their union and action of one upon the other. It is axiomatic for him that the nature of the mind is to think. There's no argument to this effect, nor even any proof that the mind or soul exists. Like the existence of bodies, it is taken for granted. Finally, only in the sixth discourse, the final chapter of the work, does Cordemois explicitly address the question of the nature of mind and return to that of the body, and consider the certainty of their existence. The discussion comes practically as an afterthought. Cordemois notes that he is really addressing here only those who think that sans ce que la foi nous apprend de l'âme, on aurait de grands sujets en douter, et que s'il n'était fort soumis au christianisme, il ne croit absolument que le corps. His reply to such people is that he does not think that there is, in fact, anything more certain to the mind than the mind itself, and that he is surprised that any reasonable person could doubt this. To put such foolish doubts to rest, then, he first explains again what the nature of body is and what properties are essential to it, and then what the soul or mind is, namely, ce qui pense à quelque chose. These definitions reveal the utter and absolute distinction between soul and body. We can thus say that for Cordemois, the first principle of philosophy is a metaphysical claim. As he puts it, je connais premièrement que l'âme ou ce qui pense est différent du corps. Only then, after establishing the nature of the soul, does he argue for the indubitability of the existence of the self as soul. Here's how he presents the argument. Je vois même que quand je voudrais douter de toutes les choses que je conçois, quand je pense au corps, je ne pourrais en même temps douter de ma pensée. Car qu'il soit faux, si vous voulez qu'il y ait aucun corps au monde, il ne peut être qu'il n'y ait aucune pensée, tandis que je serai pensant. Or, comment puis-je croire que ma pensée soit la même chose que ce que j'appelle corps, vu que je puis supposer qu'il n'y a point de corps, et que je ne puis supposer que je ne pense pas, la supposition même étant une pensée. We can see that establishing the existence of the mind or soul is not really of any concern to Cordemois. He practically rushes through any kind of cogito exercise on his way to his main prize. The certainty or indubitability of the soul's existence, something that he believes that it is foolish even to question, is merely an epistemological feature of the soul that helps to establish the soul's absolute metaphysical distinction from the body. And the knowledge of this distinction even precedes any knowledge of the existence of the one or the other. The rest of this final chapter of the work is devoted to showing what belongs to the mind and what belongs to the body in our varied experience, and how these two constituent parts of a human being conspire and relate. What is even more surprising is that now Cordemois admits that the existence of body is not so certain after all. Je vois que l'argument de l'âme est indubitable. et que jusqu'ici il n'y a un point qui m'assure du corps. He admits, or at least seems to admit, that he is not really persuaded that he has a certain body, nor the existence of external bodies, not through the senses, which often deceive us, and not through reason. Ainsi ma pensée demeure certaine, tandis qu'à parler en philosophe, ce que je crois de mon corps reste fort douteux. And yet, as we have seen, Cordoba began his treatise with the categorical claim, on sait qu'il y a des corps et que le nombre en est presque infini. I think what these two contrasting passages on the knowledge of the existence of body indicate is not so much an inconsistency in Cordoba as what he's really interested in. There are certain philosophical questions, mainly of an epistemological nature, that simply do not interest him. These are quarrels in which he does not care to engage. Je veux de mon côté ne plus penser à ce qui m'a fait douter du corps. Faith alone assures him that bodies exist, and for this purposes, this is good enough. For his purposes, this is good enough. The cogito argument, whereby the existence of the soul is evident by the natural light, is thus, for this unorthodox Cartesian, not a foundational philosophical moment at all, but rather just a brief polemical excursus. Nothing follows from it, not substantively, not even methodologically, such as the discovery of a criterion of truth. Let me note as well that while for Cordoba there is in good Cartesian fashion an asymmetry in the certainty of our knowledge of the existence of the mind and of the body, he also believes that our knowledge of the nature of the mind is no more and no less certain than our knowledge of the nature of bodies. The two are on a par. This represents a departure not only from Laforge's view, but of course from that of Descartes as well. And it will also represent a difference from Malebranche's account, but in a very different way. Now on to Malebranche, the most interesting case of all, both because of his importance as the most prominent Cartesian in the second half of the century, and because of the way in which he reverses the standard Cartesian position on knowledge of the soul. In the final book, of De la Recherche de la Vérité, Malebranche offers the by then classical Cartesian dictum. De toutes nos connaissances, la première c'est l'existence de notre âme. Tous nos pensées sont des démonstrations incontestables, car il n'y a rien plus évident que ceux qui pensent actuellement et actuellement quelque chose. Not quite a presentation of the cogito argument, but close enough. But then he immediately follows this up with the very un-Cartesian claim that s'il est facile de connaître l'existence de son âme, il n'est pas si facile d'en connaître l'essence et la nature. Now, in one sense, Malebranche cannot mean what he says here. After all, by the time he gets to book 6, he has already done quite a bit of epistemology and metaphysics. And perhaps the existence of the soul is the first and easiest of our cognitions in some kind of introspective process. And this should be taken as a descriptive psychological claim. But the existence of the mind or soul is obviously not where Malebranche's philosophizing begins. Among many other things, he has already demonstrated the distinction between the soul and the body, and even the essence and nature of the soul, the nature and properties of the understanding, the will, the senses, etc. Indeed, it was at the beginning of Book 3 that he explains how it cannot be doubted that l'essence de l'esprit ne consiste que dans la pensée, de même que l'essence de la matière ne consiste que dans l'étendue. What Malebranche does mean, as we all know, is that there is a pair of asymmetries between knowledge of the soul and knowledge of bodies. First, knowledge of the existence of the soul is more certain and indubitable than knowledge of the existence of bodies. Cogito-type reflection reveals with absolute certainty the existence of the soul, whereas the existence of the bodies cannot be demonstrated by reason alone with any certainty. We do have good and compelling reasons to believe that extended bodies exist. The testimony of the senses, taken together with the veracity of God, who is the cause of our sensations on the occasion of bodily motions, is sufficient to assure us that bodies exist. But, Malebranche continues, this does not amount to a perfect demonstration with geometric rigor. Such a demonstration would require a supernatural revelation from God that he has in fact created a material world, something that Malebranche concedes, je ne trouve point prouvé dans les ouvrages de M. Descartes. But he does find in the opening chapters of the Bible, making it ultimately a matter of faith. On the other hand, knowledge of the nature of bodies and of all the modifications of which bodies are capable is revealed with perfect certainty through the idea of extension that we see in God. This concept represents an infallible and an infinite source of knowledge of bodies through the intelligible ideas that God ordinarily reveals to us. We see toutes les propriétés d'une manière très parfaite. By contrast, he notes, il n'en est pas de même de l'âme. Nous ne le connaissons point par son idée. Nous ne le voyons point en Dieu. Nous ne la connaissons que par conscience, et c'est pour cela que la connaissance que nous en avons est imparfaite. Nous ne savons de notre âme que ce que nous sentons se passer en nous. We do not have access to any idea of the soul, neither in ourselves nor in God. Knowing the soul is a learning process, and an empirical and inductive one at that. Only experience can tell us what the soul is capable of, the kinds of sensation that it might undergo, and the kinds of activities it can perform. Lacking a clear and distinct, intelligible idea of the soul, such as we have for body, we do not have a priori deductive and demonstrative information on this score. We can come to a knowledge of such features of the soul only through what Malebranche calls sentiment intérieur, by actually experiencing them. Thus, Malebranche concludes, qu'encore que nous connaissons plus distinctement l'existence de notre âme que l'existence de notre corps et de ce qui nous environ, cependant, nous n'avons pas une connaissance si parfaite de la nature de l'âme que de la nature des corps. What we see in Courtois and the Malebranche is a decentering of the cogito. I'm tempted to say even a burying of it. Guéroult, in his study of Malebranche, calls it a déchéance du cogito, or demotion. The cogito itself plays practically no role in either thinker's pursuit of their epistemological or metaphysical projects. Moreover, both thinkers reject the orthodox Cartesian view that the soul is, in its nature, including the properties or modifications of which it is capable, better known than the body. Now, I should note that what I have said so far about Malebranche applies mainly to the Recherche of 1674 to 75, although the Sixième Éclaircissement, added to the 1700 edition, carries on the same theme. However, in the Entretien sur la métaphysique of 1688, the cogito argument apparently resumes its privileged position in the order of philosophizing. When the niceties and preliminaries are over and it's time for Theodore to lead his interlocutor Aristides toward a clearer vision of things, he first asks him to reject everything that has come into the mind through the senses or the imagination, and even pretend that he does not have a body. What is the first thing to be discovered? Not surprisingly, it's the certainty of one's own existence, framed as the cogito argument, albeit with a metaphysical axiom as its first premise. Le néant n'a point de propriété. Je pense, donc je suis. Mais que suis-je, moi qui pense, dans le temps que je pense? Suis-je encore un esprit, un homme? Je ne sais encore rien de tout cela. Je sais seulement que dans le temps que je pense, je suis quelque chose qui pense. It is interesting to note, as Tad Schmaltz has done, that the general principle at work here, justifying the conclusion that I exist, is the principle nothingness has no properties. Whereas in the Recherche, it is the principle that what actually thinks is actually something. Moreover, as Tad notes, there is the complication that the presence of these principles in Malebranche's summary of the cogito seems inconsistent with his claim elsewhere in the Recherche, that I perceive the connection between my thinking and my existing not by reasoning, but by a simple view. Be that as it may, in the Entretien, there is the cogito once again right back where it belongs, at the beginning of philosophizing. Then again, this is a dialogue, perhaps closer to Descartes' meditation format than either Malebranche's or Courtois' more systematic treatises are. What Guéroult says of Descartes' meditations is likewise true of Malebranche's Entretien, that what they are is the initiation of one soul by another, acting as its guide. So it's an interesting question, and something we might discuss today, as to whether the centrality of the cogito is a function of philosophical genre. It is certainly a function of choice of methodological approach. Guéroult, of course, had much to say about this. I exist as a thinking thing, Guéroult noted, is the first indubitable truth in the order of reasons. And it comes where it does in the Meditations, Guéroult insists, because this little treatise comprises the essential elements of philosophy set forth according to their true justification. For Descartes, at least, it appears to come down to the difference between the method of analysis, the order of discovery, or ratio cognoscendi, and the method of synthesis, the order of results, or ratio essendi. Again, to quote Guéroult, according to analytic order, one begins with a certain knowledge of myself, which as first truth for the subject is for me the first principle. By contrast, in the synthetic mode of presentation in which Descartes frames his major conclusions in his reply to the second objections, the existence of the mind and the claim that the mind can be known more easily than any corporeal thing is not the starting point, but only the second postulate, and comes well after a number of metaphysical definitions of thought, idea, substance, etc. The first reality, when proceeding by synthesis, is not the self, but God, or a metaphysical category like substance. And yet, I don't see this methodological distinction playing much of a role in either Courtemois or Malebranche. Neither has adopted a true analytic mode of proceeding. But then again, in neither case are we dealing with a properly synthetic method of presenting results, one that would justify delaying the presentation of the cogito. It may be that they just did not find the question of establishing the soul's existence that interesting or important a maneuver. Good perhaps for a first-time meditator, or somebody who, like Aristides, is just starting to philosophize, but so obvious as not to be worth the time. Of much greater urgency for these later Cartesians is establishing the nature of the soul as an immaterial thinking thing and as distinction from the body, and this does not require any cogito-like exercise. Perhaps the more interesting question to be pursued is what any of this has to say about changes in the philosophical conceptions of the self in the 17th century, and the role of such questions in philosophical inquiry generally. I'm very skeptical of the claim that the notion of the self first arises in this period, as some intellectual historians have insisted. And I'm just as skeptical that the origin of this notion lies in the Cartesian cogito, not least because, as Arnaud first pointed out to Descartes, the cogito argument goes back at least to Augustine. But that's matter for another study. Thank you.
Merci infiniment, Steve, pour cette présentation très dense. Dans une demi-heure, c'est une vraie reconstruction de l'histoire du cogito, qui en effet, c'est une histoire du redimensionnement du cogito. Enfin, bien, je pense que le moment est arrivé de lancer les débats. Prego, Mattia.
Vous pouvez indiquer que vous voulez poser les questions avec la petite main que vous trouvez dans la partie supérieure de la fenêtre de votre écran. Alors, nous pouvons commencer avec Monsieur Agostini, je pense, et après Monsieur Agostini avec Stefano Di Bella.
Je laisse la parole à nos invités. Donc, je crois que le premier, c'est, après moi, c'est ou Stefano Di Bella ou Dan Garber.
Oui.
Dan.
Et c'est Frédéric Dubuisson en question aussi.
Ah, Frédéric aussi, il y a.
Ah, je suis en train de les voir. Alors,
on peut commencer avec Dan. Et après...
Oui. Alors, oui. Alors, Monsieur Garber, vous pouvez poser votre question.
Thank you very much. All three of the talks were really lovely and interesting. I have a question, though, for Tad. I think it's very interesting to sort of refocus the debate between Hobbes and Descartes on the question of extension and location. And I think it's also really wonderful to bring in Henry Moore, for whom the question of location winds up being tremendously central. But I'm just a little bit puzzled by your framing of the issue in terms of was Hobbes dogmatic or not? Was he a dogmatic materialist or not? In one way or another, each of these characters is appealing to what they take to be first principles, which are, in some way or another unquestionable, or which they don't question in any case. And it's interesting to move from the idea that in Hobbes, the first principle is simply that all of our thoughts are about body, which I think he did indeed believe, to the question, to the point that everything is in a place, and that coordinate with that everything in a place is a body. Isn't that just as dogmatic as what you call the dogmatic materialism?
So good. Thank you, Dan. And I'm hoping everyone can hear me this time.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I think the principle that everything that exists has to exist somewhere, that isn't going to count as dogmatic in the same way as the view that everything we conceive as possible has to be conceived through sensory ideas. And the reason it's not as dogmatic is shown by the fact that a non-materialist like Moore accepts that premise. Now, as you know, to get the materialism out, you need the further claim that whatever is extended is material.
Yeah.
And there, the notion of the relation of impenetrability to extension is going to be important. But the interesting thing is that Descartes, when he talks about true extension, comes close to admitting that something is in a location by means of impenetrable extension. He draws back from it, he concedes to Moore, but even so, this shows that this is a less obviously problematic line of argument than the one he suggested in the third objections.
No, I think I agree with you in all of that. It's just, it seems strange. What you have is three people with interestingly overlapping common principles, but also interesting non-overlapping. Where is it they differ? And that, it seems to me, is the real story of what it is that's going on. And putting it in terms of dogmatism is...
Yeah, well, I think, I take that point. I think I put it in those terms, latching on to Curley's claim about the argument being dogmatic. And so the claim was just that this is not as dogmatic if we run the argument through the issue of location.
Yeah. No. Thank you.
Thanks.
Alors, nous avons la question de Monsieur Di Bella.
I would have a question for all three, but maybe too many. And for mine, it was more a comment than a question. So I go to Terchman, and so I don't believe that the hypothesis of Hobbes, not materialist in the fourth, is something likely, or so I agree that Hobbes is surely a materialist when he raises objection to Descartes, and yes, the ground for him can be an argument from location or also other arguments, but I don't find the argument from location especially persuasive or less dogmatic. Because, for instance, Bayeux's judgment seems to me so controversial. When Bayeux says that for all people, the idea of non-external spirit is something absurd, and so I think it's not so convincing from a historical point of view. But I want to ask you this. What do you mean about the possibility of finding an argument, Hobbes' argument, in what he says in this passage when after referring to the West? There is this strange passage. It is surely a very elliptical argument, if it is an argument. Now, when he says non auto in colligitur me cogitare per alia cogitazione and so on, it seems to me that, for instance, Nadler has tried to spell out a kind of argument. Of course, here in Hobbes it is very elliptical, but maybe there is something to draw from this. So I wish to ask you whether you consider also this possibility, or what you think about. And so for the other question was for Nadler. So very interesting this sound to speak of the Cogito. And my question is that for present day readers, we the reception of the Cogito is much of epistemologically oriented. I mean, is the foundational aspect of the Cogito which maybe comes to the fore and so on. And it seems to me that this is for Descartes, from the point of view of Descartes, okay, there is, of course, this foundational role, but very important is the function of the doubt and of Cogito in order to achieve the real distinction. So it's the central part of second meditation. I think that is precisely. And in this sense, you say at the end of your handout that for all these also maybe the big issue was the mind-body distinction. But yes, curiously enough, they also don't use maybe the Cogito in this sense. Of course, it seems to me that when they use it, you make the example of the Anthropien, the Malebranche Anthropien. When they use the Cogito, they use exactly in this way. So in function of the distinction and the mind-body distinction. So this was my question. What do you think about?
Steve, did you want to start, or do you want me to?
I'm just going to. Well, I was muted, and I said, "Tad, do you want to go first?"
Sure. Well, do you want to, or?
I'll just say I just find it's almost in Malebranche. I mean, you're right that when the Cogito is used, as Stefano is correct, that when you do find the Cogito used, it is as a kind of lip service to drawing the real distinction. That is in Malebranche, at least, and to some extent in Cordemois. But I think by that point, they have already, for their own purposes, established that distinction. And I don't see the Cogito doing that kind of epistemological work for them. But I also think it's, it's rather opaque what role the Cogito is playing for those two thinkers, as well as for Laforge. Tad, après tout.
Okay, sure. Passing the baton to me. And there's a lot there in what you said, Stefano. pick out a couple things, and then you can tell me if you want to hear more. I did start with the Bale quote because I thought it would be surprising that that someone would have thought that this was the common view. And I think from contemporary perspective, More's position seems odd and out of step. But I think what the Bale quote shows is maybe not so much as we think today. And that this view might have been more, that immaterial things have to have some kind of extension, was more prominent, certainly among the sort of Cambridge Platonists, but others as well, than we think today. And so from this perspective, what's odd is the nullist position, that immaterial things can have no location whatsoever. So that was supposed to be sort of a jarring quote that at least prompted the question of whether this view that immaterial substances are essentially extended might not be more prevalent than we realize today. I haven't done historical research on how prevalent it in fact was, but I think More might not be as much of an outsider in this discussion than we might think. With regard to Hobbes's, I guess I'm not very sanguine that we'll get out a very convincing argument passage in the third objections that appeals to the case of the wax. There, I guess I think Descartes' right that it's fundamentally a very weak argument because the discussion of the wax has nothing to say about the case of the subject of thought. So there, I guess I agree with Descartes against Hobbes. And so my attempt was to look for something different from that perhaps could take the argument forward a bit further.
It was after the one example, the possible argument maybe was in the line after.
I see.
I don't want to say that Hobbes' argument works, but the question is whether there is an argument there.
So I guess with respect to that point, so I quoted Dan and Ed Curley, and I guess I'm inclined to see the main argument there as appealing to the sort of theory of ideas in terms of which whatever is possible has to be conceivable, whatever is conceivable, we have to conceive in terms of sensory ideas. And so since we have no sensory ideas of an immaterial subject of thought, that would be impossible. And this is, connected to the notion that there's a contradiction in the notion of incorporeal spirit or immaterial substance. Incorporeal substance, sorry. So I guess I saw that as the more complete argument in the third objections. And that faces Curley's objections just dogmatic to assume this theory of ideas that Descartes clearly rejects and allows for the possibility of a conception of an immaterial thing. So the question is that all that Hobbes has to offer, this theory of ideas? And this is what led me in thinking about Duncan's view, led me to this location argument that I found in a work that precedes the third objections, as a matter of fact. And that seemed to me to indicate another route Hobbes could have gone. So, thank you.
Alors, nous pouvons passer à la question de Monsieur Desbouzons.
Frédéric, le microphone. Et
il y a toujours.
Non, il faut activer le microphone. À droite,
That microphone can be a tricky thing. I speak from experience.
But he's muted. It's not the microphone. He's muted.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, but he has got the
Perhaps
possibility to activate it.
Yeah, perhaps he could type his question into the chat. He could type his question.
The chat isn't open to.
Oh,
So
and there he goes.
But he could email it. That's what I did to
Yeah.
Igor Mattia.
Okay.
Let's.
But we lost him, so
Yes.
I think that you can pose your question, and we can wait for Monsieur de Bouzon.
Yes, in fact, I have two questions. The first one is both to Steve and Murray, and the second is for Tad. I begin with Tad because, in fact, I have the same point that Stefano. I think that what Carly stresses is that Hobbes' objection is, in fact, an anticipation of the argument of Kant's confutation of idealism. And this can explain the reference to the works, in the sense that works is permanent, but thought is always successive. As a consequence, the res cogitans is material. This is the Carly argument. I'm not sure that this is a strong argument, but this is a possibility, I think. So my second question is I would begin to pose the question to Murray. You could have considered a fourth phase of the Cogito. I don't know. I don't remember if in the book you spoke about that, but in the paper tonight in the paper I didn't find the argument. That is, you can consider the Cogito as founded not in the universal proposition whatever things exist, but on the modal proposition pour penser il faut être. It's necessary to exist in order to think. This is not a universal proposition, but this is a modal proposition.
And would you just repeat the modal proposition? I didn't hear it.
Pour penser, il faut être. It's not a universal proposition. Whatever things exist. But this is a modal proposition. And this is a crucial point, because in this case, we have a premise, but we don't have a syllogism. It's not my interpretation. It's an older interpretation given, I think, by Conrad Mark Vogel. And what I wanted to ask to Steve is the same. Did you find in the history of the Cogito some author who presents the Cogito as founded not in the universal proposition, whatever things exist, but on this modal proposition that Descartes uses in the second replies? Descartes uses this premise. I can quote just a moment, perhaps. No, I don't have the text here, so thank you.
Murray, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll make one comment. I'm not sure that proposition, pour penser, il faut exister, really is a different proposition. I mean, it embodies the same rational insight, and it's a modal insight, into the necessary relationship between thinking and existing. Now, that necessary relationship can be expressed on the one hand by saying whatever thinks exists, or on the other hand by saying that pour penser, il faut exister. It seems to me that what underlies this is simply a grasp of the necessary connectedness of those two concepts. Call it a modal intuition, but it is universal. I mean, modal intuitions are universal. it seems to me. They must be. That is to say, we can have a modal intuition of a universal nature in the first instance by finding it instantiated in a particular case. For example, the relationship between my own thinking and my own existing. But I can extrapolate from that by a process that I think is epigogic rather than inductively generalizing. We can extrapolate from that the universal proposition, everything which thinks exists. So that would be my comment. It's not a fourth face, but it's another way of formulating the third face. I don't know whether that convinces you or not.
Just a short, very short reply. Of course, it can be traduced in a universal proposition, but the point is that if I use just the modal proposition, it can function as a rule of inference.
Yeah.
Which is not the case of universal proposition. And this is the case, I think, with the Cogito. I think the only premise, the rule of inference, pour penser il faut être, and the conclusion.
Yeah, and I would say for Descartes, that rule is implicit in I think. Okay? It takes a certain amount of reflection to realize that it's there. It's that rule, as you call it, which permits the transition from cogito to sum. But it's not a logical transition. I would just reiterate that point. But perhaps Steve wanted to step in at this point.
I wanted Mary to go first so I could actually review some of the texts. But to answer Igor's question, I do find that proposition in the text, and especially in Malebranche, where he says what actually thinks is actually something, which is not exactly the proposition you identify, but I think close enough to make, as you say, a modal claim, not much a universal claim for a syllogism. It doesn't seem to function in a syllogistic way in Malebranche. And then there's the, he seems to rely though more heavily on the claim, nothing has no properties, rather than whatever thinks it is.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
Thank you.
But it's still...
Si vous m'entendez.
Oui.
Bon, j'ai relancé l'application. Alors, j'ai une... excusez-moi, je parle en français. Je vais essayer de parler lentement. J'ai une très brève question qui porte sur l'exposé de Steve Nadler. Il a cité à un moment une phrase de Louis de Laforge, ou plus exactement un membre de phrase qui indique « cette substance qui pense en moi ». Cette substance qui pense en moi. Et il s'agit, quand on regarde le texte plus complètement, il s'agit de l'âme, virgule, cette substance, entre parenthèses, c'est-à-dire cette substance qui pense en moi. Alors, je vais poser une question extrêmement simple. Est-ce que cette phrase peut être considérée comme une phrase cartésienne? Je veux dire que elle introduit à l'évidence une distinction entre l'activité de pensée et le moi. Cette substance qui pense en moi. Elle pourrait penser ailleurs, elle pourrait, etc. Alors, ou alors, on peut poser la question de la manière suivante, est-ce que cette phrase est cartésienne, ou bien est-ce que moi veut dire autre chose que ce que Descartes nomme moi lorsqu'il évoque le cogito?
Oui, au lieu de dire que moi, la substance qui pense, ce serait plus cartésien.
Oui, bien sûr.
Oui,
mais Oui, mais je veux dire, parce que la phrase de Laforge évoque des phrases postérieures, hein, par exemple de Malebranche, sur ce qui se passe en moi, malgré moi et sans moi. Mais c'est pas ça qu'il dit ici, hein. C'est cette substance qui pense en moi. Le sens me paraît extraordinairement obscur. Voilà, c'est tout.
Oui, absolument d'accord. Et comme vous savez, cette question va jusqu'au cœur de la question de l'identité personnelle.
Bien sûr, oui, bien sûr.
Et je crois, chez Laforge et aussi chez Descartes, c'est vraiment question difficile, parce que chez Descartes, il y a des textes où l'identité est placée dans l'âme toute seule, et les autres textes où l'identité est placée dans l'âme-cœur.
Dans le composé, oui.
Et chez Laforge, à mon avis, je trouve que pour Laforge, le corps est plus un instrument pour l'âme. Au lieu de... c'est l'âme qui emploie le corps.
Là, ça serait plutôt l'inverse. Je veux dire, c'est l'âme qui est un instrument du corps.
Oui, exactement.
C'est Platon, ça.
Oui. Et la proposition que vous avez citée semble indiquer que non, le moi n'est pas simplement l'âme, mais les deux choses sont... Donc, non, je n'ai pas une bonne réponse à la question, parce que il y a beaucoup d'ambiguïté, comme vous savez,
Oui.
chez Descartes et aussi chez Laforge.
D'accord, merci. Merci beaucoup.
Et alors, il y a une question de M. Pasini en ce moment, et vous pouvez poser votre question.
Il n'a pas
Enrico,
activé,
prego.
il n'a pas activé le microphone.
Il y a toujours un certain délai entre l'autorisation à ouvrir son microphone et la possibilité réelle de l'ouvrir. Je n'ai pas une question, c'est seulement une petite chose à ajouter à la question de Frédéric de Buzon. En fait, le thème de la possibilité que l'âme pense hors de moi, hors de mon corps, est un des thèmes les plus répandus dans la polémique satirique anti-cartésienne. Il y a des représentations de l'âme de Descartes qui se promènent dans le monde, qui va trouver les lapins dans le
livre de Gabriel Daniel.
Dans le Grand Nord, etc. Donc, ce n'est pas seulement une question théorétique qui s'ajoute à une discussion métaphysique, mais en fait, c'est une partie de la réception et perception du contenu de la proposition fondamentale discutée parmi les cartésiennes. C'était seulement ça.
D'accord.
Ciao, Frédéric.
Et je crois qu'un bon cartésien a besoin de trouver l'identité personnelle dans l'âme toute seule. Parce qu'après la mort, il faut que c'est moi qui survit et pas quelqu'un d'autre. Ce n'est pas une substance impersonnelle.
Oui, bien sûr.
Bien.
Je pense que nous avons terminé avec les questions.
Merci. Alors, je voudrais remercier tout le monde pour la participation, mais juste une minute, je voudrais laisser la parole à Giulia Belgioioso pour nous saluer. Giulia?
Et en ce moment,
Et le microphone.
Ça marche ou non?
je ne l'avais pas reconnu avec les noms différents.
Giulia, se di nuovo ribloccato il microfono.
Voilà.
Ah, perfetto.
Ok. Alors,
No, si è ribloccato il microfono, forse ci premi sopra.
Non, non, voilà, ça marche?
Sì.
Oui.
Voilà. Alors, simplement pour dire que je ne crois pas que la Forge fait partie de ceux qui ont dit Descartes de manière satirique, en tout cas. De toute façon, je remercie beaucoup Igor de me permettre de saluer tous les amis de longue date, les collègues plus jeunes. Et c'est vraiment un plaisir de vous voir, même à la distance. Et je vous remercie d'être ici. Et je suis très contente que Igor va continuer la tradition des colloques qui sont commencés en Italie il y a longtemps, quand on a au moment dans lequel est né les instituts cartésiens. Je m'arrête pour dire que vraiment les communications ont été très, très intéressantes. Et donc, j'ai déjà un peu préoccupé pour les conclusions que je dois tirer demain soir, parce que c'est vraiment la richesse des arguments qui ont été touchés, c'est vraiment très, très, très important et c'est très difficile. Ce sera très difficile pour moi. De toute façon, merci à tout le monde. Je salue tout le monde et merci aussi à Mattia, qui enfin, c'est lui qui, sur le plan pratique, peut permettre de nous rencontrer même à la distance. Bonne soirée à tout le monde. Au revoir.
Bonsoir.
Merci.
Buenas noches.
Alors, à demain.
À demain.
À demain.
Bon dîner pour les Européennes et plus tard pour les Américaines.
Et les Américains, quelle heure est dans les États-Unis maintenant?
C'est presque 2 heures. 17 heures.
17 heures, voilà.
On dit c'est 2h30.
Nous, on va manger, là.
Steve, bonne soirée.
Bonne soirée. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Et Dan, il n'est pas là. Il est sorti.
Il est là.
Non, je suis ici.
Ok, ok. Ciao Dan.
Ciao Giulia.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao Rabbiella.
A
Ciao,
demain.
buonanotte.
A domani.
A domani.
Domani.
Au revoir à tous.
Au revoir.